Hi, it's Ray. Welcome back to my channel. My shelves have been a totally disorganised mess for absolutely forever. When I came across the idea of organising classic books by year of publication, I thought that was absolutely genius. It'd be so cool to get a sense of what came out into the world and when, how other authors may or may not have played off of each other. So I set about chronologically ordering my classics, and it actually turned out to be a much bigger project than I thought it was going to be. It was quite the research project, but very interesting. One of the things that this really brought home to me is the fact that I don't own a lot of classics that I consider my favourite classics. So I'm only organising the books, obviously, that I have with me in the Congo. I do have quite a lot of other books back at my parents' house. And when I chose books to bring out here, I largely chose books that I hadn't already read. So there's definitely some really conspicuous author absences in here. There's no Gaskell, there's hardly any Brontes, there's only one Dickens novel. I hope one day to be reunited with all of my books, and I also realised that a large number of the classics that I've read in my life were actually just my mum's books that I borrowed, so maybe this can be a nice excuse for developing my own classic library in the future. So welcome to my pretty random selection of classic books. I nonetheless adore it. With the exception of ancient Greece, I've roughly organised with UK time periods, which I did just get off Wikipedia, so please forgive any mistakes, or feel free to correct them in the comments. Right, first off we have Aesop's Fables, the only ancient Greek book that I seem to have with me in Congo. Supposedly written by a Greek slave, it just absolutely blows my mind how old these fables are and the fact that they're still such a regular part of our modern day vocabulary. Next we move forward about 1,000 years to the Anglo-Saxon period and the tale of monster-slaying Beowulf. Oh, I love Old English literature. Alliterative poetry is absolutely my favourite, and Heaney's translation is gorgeous. There's a new translation of Beowulf by Maria Headley, and apparently it's extremely modern and feminist, so a totally different take on it to Heaney, and I am so excited to read that. I could wax lyrical about Beowulf for ages, and perhaps this book will give me the opportunity to do just that. Next up, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight into the medieval period. My favourite work of literature from the medieval period, way above Chaucer. This is another alliterative poem telling the story of Sir Gawain and his quest to find the bizarre figure of the Green Knight and thus fulfil his chivalric duty following a Yuletide beheading game. It's mad but also wonderful. My goodness, the texture and the vibrancy of the language in this poem. On to the 1600s, and here I put the Bible because it's the King James Version. Obviously the Bible was written before that, but the 1611 publishing of the King James Version of the Bible was a literary landmark, and its language has influenced writers ever since. A prime example being John Milton's Paradise Lost, arguably the British epic poem. Tells the story of Satan's fall from grace, his tempting of Adam and Eve, and Milton's characterisation of Satan is something else. Next up we have Jonathan Swift's satirical novel Gulliver's Travels, followed by Sir Walter Scott's romantic Ivanhoe, neither of which I have yet read. We have a collection of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tales, and a collection of poetry by Edgar Allan Poe, who I hadn't realised had died quite early on in the Victorian period. In 1843, we had Charles Dickens's perfect Christmas story, A Christmas Carol, followed by the 1847 novel so close to my heart, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, which I have in French, in a vintage edition, and in a Penguin Black Classics edition. Then in 1849, we have Shirley, also by Charlotte Bronte, and the only Bronte novel that I have not yet read. This is historical fiction, and I've heard such mixed things about it. Some people really hate it, and some people think it's fantastic, so I really do need to get around to reading it at some point. Then my drop-dead gorgeous folio edition of Nathaniel Hawthorne's A Wonder Book for Boys and Girls. These are gorgeous retellings of ancient Greek mythology for children. The language is just so rich and magical, and the drawings are phenomenal. It's really a perfect treat for anyone of any age. Then we have The Mill on the Floss by George Eliot. I haven't read this. Apparently it's about a wayward and fiercely intelligent woman and her different relationships with the various men in her life as she grows up, which sounds absolutely amazing. I really admired Middlemarch, so I'm very much looking forward to this. Next up, in 1869, Little Women. I know all of these books are classics, but this is just such a classic. The heartwarming story of the March sisters and their genteel poverty during the US Civil War. Madly in the same year, we have Lorna Doone by R.D. Blackmore, which I once started to read and I remember finding the language feeling quite challenging, so I thought that I would come back to it another point. Although with the benefit of hindsight, I think I started trying to read it on the coach on the way back from having taken year 6 on residential for a week, so it's not really much of a surprise that I was too tired to be able to engage with it properly. It's subtitled A Romance of Exmoor, and I am really looking forward to it. What Katie Did, the children's story about Katie coming to terms with extreme injury after falling off a swing. I quite enjoyed this one, but it's not one of my all-time favourite children's novels. Jacqueline Wilson's done an interesting modern-day rewrite which challenges some of the extremely Victorian moral lessons that exist in this tale. Then we have Heidi, gorgeous story of sweet little girl in the Swiss Alps whose love and kindness wins over the jaded and miserable older people around her. Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. I have not read this, but it would be quite interesting to read and find out just how different it is to the Disney film, that being the only version of the story that I actually know. Then Bram Stoker's Dracula, the classic gothic tale of vampires. Here I slotted in Conrad's Congo. This was not published in the Victorian period, but it contains a number of primary sources from and related to the Congo at around the time that Conrad was writing and publishing Heart of Darkness. Heart of Darkness being the next book that I've got on my shelves here. This is Conrad's deeply layered novella telling the story of Marlowe's trip up the Congo River in an attempt to find Kurtz, the ivory trader who he suspects has gone mad. I have not read this book for years and years. I read it when I was probably too young and didn't understand any of it. I'm not even sure whether I would understand it now. There is so much interesting debate and analysis surrounding this book, though, that I actually think that reading a load of literary criticism about it would probably be just as interesting, if not more interesting, than rereading the actual book. And finally, for the Victorian era, this is a collection of Victorian children's literature, containing At the Back of the North Wind, as well as various other children's stories and short stories from the Victorian period. Into the Edwardian period, we have Rudyard Kipling's Just So stories, which are kind of like made-up creation myths. Then we have The Wind in the Willows. This is possibly my favourite book that I own in terms of beauty, and is also a lovely story about a load of animals who very much behave as people and their life on the riverbanks throughout the British seasons. Then Anne of Green Gables. This is the first in the lovely Anne Shirley series. I say the lovely series, I actually adore the first 4 books in this series, and then I'm not really fussed about the ones after that at all, to the extent I quite actively dislike them. But the first few books are full of such joy and energy and delight and wonder. Anne Shirley is a heroine who continues to inspire so many people to this day, and whose attitude to life genuinely buoys me up. These books got me through my first year of teaching, and I still turn to Anne in the good times and the bad. After Anne of Green Gables, 1 year later, Ellen Montgomery published the next book in the series, Anne of Avonlea. So orphaned Anne lives with Marilla and Matthew Cuthbert. In the first book, she's a child. In the second book, she is a teenager. And it tells various tales of her life and her adventures in the town of Avonlea. Then we have Frances Hodgson Burnett's The Secret Garden. I read this extremely recently. It's the beautiful story of a young orphan and how her experience of finding a secret garden transforms her own life and the lives of those around her. Finally, we have the first volume of Proust, the first of his 7-volume exploration of memory. I have not read this and I don't really know what to expect from it, to be honest. If you've read it, let me know what it's like. Then into the First World War period, even though none of these books are actually about the First World War. We have D.H. Lawrence's The Rainbow. This is a prequel to Women in Love. I say prequel, I think he wrote it first. And it's a family saga set in Nottinghamshire. I adore D.H. Lawrence. I can't wait to read this and Women in Love, neither of which I have read yet, so I'm really excited to get around to those sometime soon. Then, also in 1915, we have Anne of the Island. This is the only other Anne of Green Gables book that I actually own. I think it's the best in the series, hands down, easily the best. This is her university years, and I adore them. In the Forsyte Saga, this is a family saga in which everyone is called Jolyon. It looks at the relationships of the Forsyte family from Victorian times to post-World War I. I watched and loved the adaptation of this many years ago, but for some reason have only so far read the first volume, Man of Property, so I need to get back on it. Then in 1923 we have Emily of New Moon. This is L.M. Montgomery's far lesser known trilogy of books about Emily. I absolutely adore them. Emily is far more introverted than Anne, and I relate to her far, far more. In this novel, she becomes orphaned and moves to New Moon with some relatives. When We Were Very Young, this is a collection of poetry by A.A. Milne, followed by, in 1925, Emily Climbs, the second novel in the Emily trilogy and my absolute favourite of the three by far. In 1926, we have Winnie the Pooh, no explanation needed. 1927, Tarka the Otter. This is a book about an otter in the wild, and I believe it goes down the staying true to the wild kind of lane rather than anthropomorphizing, and is therefore quite violent. I haven't read it yet. I think it might be a bit of a Call of the Wild kind of scenario, so I'm not going to rush towards it. We also have Now We Are Six, another poetry volume, and Emily's Quest. Aren't these Virago classic covers just the most beautiful things ever? I absolutely love their editions of the children's classics. Then we have The House at Pooh Corner, another Winnie the Pooh book, and in 1931, The Country Child by Alison Utley. This was my favourite book when I was growing up. I loved it so much. It's really underrated and not very well known. It tells the story of Susan Garland and her isolated childhood on a rural Derbyshire farm in the late Victorian period. She's a deeply imaginative and quite lonely girl, quite an unusual protagonist in fact, but Utley's description of the countryside is just the most beautiful thing ever, and I love it with all of my heart to this day and always will. We have Cold Comfort Farm by Stella Gibbons. This is just an utterly delightful novel about Flora Post, who moves to live with her miserable relatives, the Starcadders, and sets herself about improving them. We have Brave New World by Huxley, the classic dystopia which is at the top of my classics I'm embarrassed not to have read yet pile. In 1934, we have A London Child of the 1870s. This is a memoir which reads like so many of those kind of country child memoirs from the Victorian period that I never seem to tire of. However, it's set in London. I would highly recommend this Persephone Classics edition of it. It had a really enlightening introduction. I read the book and then read the introduction, and it just gave it a whole new level of depth and meaning for me. I need to seek out parts 2 and 3, which I believe are out of print, but I definitely want to read the rest of Hughes's memoirs because she writes wonderfully and she's a really fascinating woman. Then we have, in 1935, Little Town on the Prairie. This is part of the Laura Ingalls Wilder Little House series. I have the whole lot at home. I loved reading these growing up. I'm actually astounded that it came out so late. In my head, they were all from, the early 1800s. But Little Town on the Prairie was my favourite of all of them, and so that's why I brought it with me. We then have Noel Streatfeild's Ballet Shoes, the story of 3 orphan children, the Fossils, and their life earning money on the stage. As a child who performed a lot, I found it disproportionately annoying that Petrova Fossil, who shows no interest in being on the stage, still manages somehow to get paid for performing, when I knew full well that if you wanted to perform as a child, it involved your parents paying a lot of money for the privilege. However, this is still a gorgeous story. I loved it very much, and I only wish that I'd read it younger. I didn't read it until I was a teenager, I think. Miss Pettigrew lives for a day. As delightful as they come, this is the story of downtrodden governess Miss Pettigrew, when she gets a new and unexpected employer who turns her life upside down. In 1939, we have Steinbeck's classic novel about the effect of the Great Depression on farmers in America, The Grapes of Wrath. In 1941, The Swish of the Curtain. This is the first in a series of books about a group of children who create the Blue Curtain Theatre. It encapsulates the magic both of childhood and of performance, and I really loved it. Then we have The Little Prince, which I have in French, its original language, and also in English. This is both a children's fable and a work of philosophy. It is wonderful. I don't know a single person who doesn't find this incredible. Throughout the war years, Flora Thompson's Lark Rise to Candleford trilogy were published, the final one being published in 1945, the first part in 1939. I hadn't realised this was published during the Second World War, and it only makes the text even more poignant because they very much capture the end of an era of an idyllic country lifestyle that technology and modernisation was erasing. Flora Thompson captures that fading world in great detail, and I'm so grateful that these books exist. We have Animal Farm, George Orwell's classic allegory about communism. And then The Little White Horse, I feel like it's quite funny putting some of these novels next to each other because they're just so different. The Little White Horse is a kind of fantasy children's story about an orphan who goes to live at Moonacre. It is extremely charming and delightful. We have The King's General by Daphne du Maurier. I have had such bad luck with Daphne du Maurier books. This is a love story set in Cornwall. I didn't know anything about it, so I read the Goodreads blurb so that I could give a quick overview of it in this video, and it revealed the entire plot to me, which is super annoying because I also had the entire plot of Rebecca revealed to me before I read that for the first time, and so I haven't really had the experience of properly enjoying a du Maurier novel with all of the suspense that entails. But never mind, it sounds like a good story, and I'm trying to blot out as much as I can from my mind of what I just read. Then we have Carts and Candlesticks. This is a collection of autobiographical memories from its author Alison Utley, the same author as The Country Child, just talking about various country living experiences, kind of similar to Lark Rise to Candleford, I think, in terms of really trying to capture and record a fading way of life. I realised that I haven't actually read this. I'd confused it in my head with A Farm on the Hill, which is the sequel to A Country Child, which I have read but is left in the UK. So that was a really nice discovery as part of making this video, and I'm looking forward to reading that soon. Then we have Dodie Smith's I Capture the Castle. What an incredible coming-of-age story this is. I read it as a teenager and absolutely adored it. I'm very due a reread. It starts with one of the best opening lines in all literature, I think. I write this sitting in the kitchen sink. That is, my feet are in it, the rest of me is on the draining board, which I've padded with our dog's blanket and the tea cosy. This is the voice of Cassandra, who's basically writing a diary, recording her life living in this tumble-down castle with her wildly eccentric family. Then we have The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. This is one of Tom's. I haven't read it, but apparently it's the extremely passionate tale of a man's obsession with an affair that was ended by the married woman he was having it with. Actually sounds really interesting. I'm looking forward to reading it. Following this, we have Lord of the Rings, which were actually published between 1954 and 1955. You would have thought that they would have been published over a much longer time period than that, given how massive they are. Obviously, famous story by J.R.R. Tolkien of the magic ring set to rule them all and the Fellowship's journey to destroy the ring in Mount Doom. I would really, really love to read The Lord of the Rings this year. My parents read them to me when I was growing up, but that was a very long time ago, and I would love to experience Tolkien's writing as an adult. Following this, we have Miss Reed. This is the first in a long series of books about a village schoolmistress. I have also read this, but again when I was a lot younger, and I found it a bit dull, but I think if I read it now, it would probably be exactly the charming sort of work of literature that I would enjoy. So I'm looking forward to rereading that again at some point. Then we have The Silver Sword. This is a wonderful children's book. It tells the story of 3 Polish refugees who are trying to find their parents after the end of the Second World War. And it's just one of those really, really well-balanced children's books that explores a topic of great hardship and suffering, but does so in a way that's sensitive and warm enough so as not to be traumatic for children, while also not overly romanticising an extremely traumatic historical event. I love this book. Also in 1956, a very different book, we have My Family and Other Animals by Gerard Durrell. His account of growing up on Corfu with his family, and from what I recall, mostly just his recordings of all of the flora and fauna that he found there, because he is extremely into animals and was a professional naturalist by the time he wrote this book. In 1957, we have Platero and I. It's a series of really short, like 2 to 3 pages, kind of letters almost, that a guy writes to his donkey. It's a totally bizarre idea, but each one is incredibly beautiful and perceptive and just looks in depth at one of life's little joys or tragedies. And there's this beautiful, beautiful relationship between the old man who's writing these passages and his donkey, who he's absolutely besotted with. It's totally unlike anything else that you've ever read, but is wonderful. Then we have Justine. This is by Lawrence Durrell, the brother of Gerard Durrell. It's the first novel in his Alexandria Quartet. The writing styles of the two brothers could not be more different. Justine is extremely modernist to the extent that I'm still not quite sure what actually happened in the book, but at the same time, I remember this as one of the most beautiful pieces of writing that I have ever read. The prose was just lyrical and descriptive and beautiful, and I really need to get around to reading the rest of the quartet. In 1958, we have a volume of E. E. Cummings' poems. Cummings makes unconventional use of punctuation in his poetry and also has a beautiful way with words. Lady whose profound and fragile lips the sweet, small, clumsy feet of April came. into the ragged meadow of my soul. Cider with Rosie by Laurie Lee. This is another one of, as you probably noticed, a genre that I really enjoy, the autobiographical country memoir. These are his memories of his childhood living in an idyllic Cotswolds village, and his writing is also phenomenally beautiful and lyrical. Then we have a Jeeves and Wooster novel. I've only actually read one of these. I think they're all pretty much the same, but very enjoyable comic tale of a wealthy man and his butler. Myths of the Norsemen next. I should maybe have put this right back in the Old English section. These are retellings of Norse mythology. Then we have The Golden Notebook. This is another book that I'm a bit afraid of, although it also sounds really interesting. It's a very feminist work about a woman who splits her life up into these different coloured notebooks. So like one colour is for politics, one colour is for personal life, etc. And then she tries to tie everything together in a gold-coloured notebook. It's quite a long novel, and I read Love Again by Doris Lessing when I was a teenager and really didn't enjoy it. I found it very hard going. So yeah, I'd like to read this at some point because it's very famous, but I do feel a little bit on edge about it. Laughter in the Dark by Vladimir Nabokov, who is famous as the author of Lolita. I have not read Laughter in the Dark, but it has a wonderful opening line. It says, "Once upon a time there lived in Berlin, Germany, a man called Albinus. He was rich, respectable, happy. One day he abandoned his wife for the sake of a youthful mistress. He loved, was not loved, and his life ended in disaster." The Summer Book by Tove Jansson. This is a gorgeous work of literature, an episodic book which looks at a summer spent on an isolated Swedish island by a grandmother and her granddaughter, their interactions, their little day-to-day livings and adventures. It's really charming. We have The Peppermint Pig by Nina Borden. This, I believe, is a story of some children who have a pig as a pet and presumably learn some lessons about life through this experience. I was not wild about Carrie's War by Nina Borden, so I haven't read The Peppermint Pig yet, but I would like to give her another go. Then we have The Emperor. This is one of Tom's. It is a report from Poland's leading foreign correspondent on how Ethiopia's last emperor, Haile Selassie, ruled and fell. We have The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. This is probably her most famous work. It's her kind of retellings of traditional fairy tales. Angela Carter is an incredible author. I studied Wise Children for A-level, absolutely loved it, but I haven't read The Bloody Chamber yet. Moving into very modern classics, some of these are really just classics that felt in my gut like they were classics. You might debate that they are not. Some of them I think are quite fairly settled as being modern classics. The first book I've got on here is The Twits by Roald Dahl. I've been reading various bits of Roald Dahl to my class over the last couple of years, and I've genuinely been so impressed with his work. He is such an inventive and imaginative author who appeals to children and adults alike. Then we have Goodnight Mr. Tom. I think this book is the reason why I didn't like Carrie's War very much, because poor old Carrie's War was read directly following Goodnight Mr. Tom, and Goodnight Mr. Tom is one of the best children's books I've ever read in my whole life. William Beach is an evacuee sent to live with super grumpy old man Mr. Tom in the countryside, but William comes from an abusive London home, and caring for him brings meaning back into Tom's life. This novel will make you cry over and over again. It explores a multitude of horrors, but it has such a powerful message of hope and love. Then we have Nights at the Circus, another novel by Angela Carter. This is a very magical realism book told by our unreliable narrator, Feathers, who is apparently part bird. Next up is Hotel du Lac. This is quite a quiet novel about a romance novelist who is staying in a hotel off-season after having had an affair with a married man and basically been banished to this hotel by her friends to take some time to reflect on her life and her direction. A lot of the novel consists of her little observations of the other guests who are staying at the hotel at the same time as her. Then we have Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is the story of a romance told over many years and doesn't really have anything to do with cholera as far as I remember. I also put Howl's Moving Castle in here, the Diana Wynne-Jones novel, a delightful fantasy about Sophie Hatter who gets turned into an old woman by the Wicked Witch of the Waste and ends up living with the enchanting yet selfish magician Howl in his moving castle. Then I have A Moment of War. This is the third book in Laura Lee's autobiographical trilogy that started with Cider with Rosie. It's actually the only one that I've not read yet. In between was As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning, which talks about his journey to Spain and his wanderings around Spain pre the Spanish Civil War, and A Moment of War is his experience of being in Spain during the Civil War. Penultimately, we have The Shadow of the Sun. This is by the same Polish journalist who wrote The Emperor. Someone recommended this to me as a great book about living as a foreigner in Africa, and given how vintage this edition looked, I thought it would have been published way earlier than 1998. Don't really know if it's a classic, but this edition definitely looks the part. And then lastly, we have His Dark Materials by Philip Pullman. These are some of my favourite books ever. I know they're super modern, but I just feel certain that these will go down in history as classics. They are so multifaceted and clever and moving. They tell the story of Lyra and her demon Pantalaimon in a world where people's souls are kind of externally expressed as an animal. There is so much politics and religion and philosophy in these books. I first read them when I was a teenager and I thought they were right, and then I read them again in my early 20s and realised that they were just a work of absolute genius. I can't wait to read them again. I also can't wait for the final part of Pullman's Book of Dust trilogy to come out. So far there has been La Belle Sauvage, which is kind of a prequel to His Dark Materials, and then The Secret Commonwealth, which takes place when Lyra is older than she is in His Dark Materials, and I have loved both of those as well. So that's the end of my chronologically ordered classic literature. This whole project has turned out to have taken so much longer than I ever imagined it was going to, so I don't think I'm ever going to order my books in any way except for chronologically ever again. Nonetheless, it was really fun to do, and it's really interesting to have a look at where everything fits in time order. I've also discovered there's probably a lot more unread books on my physical TBR than I kind of thought that there were, now that I actually delved into my bookshelves in a bit more detail, and I'm really excited to read them all. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you've enjoyed, and I'll see you very soon in my next video.